My daughter was 34 years old when she died, and she was the best thing I ever built in my life. Better than the house I framed with my own hands in Barrie. Better than the business I ran for 22 years. Better than anything I could take credit for. Her name was Alison. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness. And when she walked into a room, people noticed. Not because she was loud, because she was certain. Her mother, my wife Catherine, passed from a brain aneurysm when Alison was 11. One evening she was making chicken soup in the kitchen, humming along to something on the radio. The next morning she was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just absence, sudden and total. I raised Alison alone after that. Me, a 52-year-old contractor with calloused hands and no idea how to talk about feelings, and somehow we made it work. She cried on my shoulder at her high school graduation. I cried at hers. We didn't say much about it. We didn't need to. By the time Alison was in her late 20s, she had built something real. She had started a property management company out of Mississauga, managing residential rental portfolios for landlords who didn't want the headache of maintenance calls and lease disputes. She was good with numbers, better with people, and ruthless about detail in a way that made her clients trust her completely. By 30, she had expanded to Hamilton and Kitchener. By 32, her company was managing over 400 units across southern Ontario, and she had quietly accumulated a portfolio of her own properties. 12 units she had purchased herself over 5 years with careful, patient leverage. I didn't understand half of what she was doing, but I understood that she had built it honestly, unit by unit, year by year. She had met her ex-husband Nolan at a real estate conference in Toronto when she was 26. He was charming in that way some men are. The kind of charm that feels like attention, like being chosen. He worked in mortgage brokering, or said he did. He talked a lot about deals he was putting together, opportunities he was pursuing. I never trusted him, but I kept that to myself because Alison was happy, and I didn't want to be the kind of father who poisons things with suspicion. They married when she was 28. 2 years later, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could tell from the first 2 words, "Dad, listen," that something had broken. She told me about the money missing from their joint account. She told me about the business loan he'd taken out using her company's assets as collateral without telling her. She told me she had found messages. I didn't ask what kind. I drove to Mississauga that night and sat with her at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and we didn't solve anything, but at least she wasn't alone. The divorce took 14 months. Nolan fought for spousal support, arguing he had sacrificed his career to support her business. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Patrice, out of a firm on Bay Street, dismantled that argument line by line. Nolan walked away with a settlement. Not what he wanted, but enough to disappear. And he did disappear. For almost 9 years I heard nothing about him. Neither did Alison. We both preferred it that way. What we didn't know was that in those 9 years, Nolan had made a mess of himself. I learned this later, piece by piece, the way you learn things after a crisis, in fragments, filling in backward. He had burned through his divorce settlement on bad investments. He had declared personal bankruptcy in 2021. He had borrowed from people who were not patient about repayment. I don't know the full shape of the hole he had dug, but I know it was deep, because when he came back into our lives, he came back desperate. And desperate men do things that careful men wouldn't consider. Alison was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 33. I remember where I was when she told me, standing in my garage in Barrie, reaching for a wrench on the pegboard. My hand froze. She was calm on the phone, calmer than I was, already talking about treatment plans and timelines and what she needed to do with the business. That was Alison. She dealt with hard things by organizing them. I drove down the next morning and I didn't leave. I converted her spare bedroom into something between a home office and a recovery room, and I was there for the chemo appointments, the scans, the days when she couldn't get off the couch. 8 months of treatment. The cancer retreated, then returned. Retreated again, came back harder. The doctors were honest with her, and she was honest with me, and by the spring of what would be her last year, we both knew. She spent that final year in a way that I think about constantly. She wasn't passive about it. She got her affairs in order, not just emotionally, but legally, financially, with a thoroughness that surprised even her lawyer. She updated her will. She restructured the trust that would hold her property portfolio. She met with her accountant, her property manager, her bank, her insurance broker. She had conversations with me about things I didn't want to discuss. What she wanted for her tenants, how she wanted the foundation she'd seeded to be run, what she hoped I would do with the time and resources she was leaving me. I kept telling her to stop planning and rest. She kept telling me that planning was how she rested. She was the one who told me quietly in October of that year that Nolan had contacted her. A message through her business email, professional in tone, asking if they could speak. She hadn't responded. She showed it to Patrice, who told her to ignore it. She didn't tell me everything in that moment, and I understand now why she didn't. She didn't want me to spiral. But she had already begun documenting every message he sent, every attempted contact, every legal letter that eventually arrived from a paralegal outfit in Brampton claiming that Nolan, as her former spouse, retained certain interests and assets accumulated during their marriage that had not been fully addressed in the original divorce settlement. I found out the full scope of it 3 days after Alison's funeral. The service was at a small church in Port Credit on a gray November morning. A few dozen people, her friends from the industry, her property manager, her bookkeeper, tenants, who had become something more than tenants. I stood at the front of that church and I said what I could. I don't remember all of it. I remember saying she was the best contractor I'd ever known, that she built things meant to last, that she would have been embarrassed by the fuss. People laughed a little. That felt right. 2 days later, I was back in Mississauga, going through her papers with Patrice and Alison's accountant, a quiet man named Frank who had worked with her for 6 years. On the third day, a man I didn't recognize knocked on her front door. I answered it. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a jacket that looked expensive from a distance. Up close, I could see the collar was frayed. He had the kind of smile that expects to be believed. "Mr. Calloway," he said. He knew my name. "That's me," I said. "I'm here on behalf of Nolan. My name's not important right now. He'd like to resolve this privately if possible. There's a claim his legal team is prepared to file, but he's hoping you and he can reach an agreement before that becomes necessary." I looked at this man for a long moment. I thought of Alison at the kitchen table the night the marriage ended. I thought of her on the chemo chair reading a spreadsheet. I thought of her voice on the phone from the hospital 2 weeks before she died, still clear, still precise, telling me exactly where to find a specific folder in her filing cabinet. "Tell Nolan," I said, "that if he has a legal claim, he should file it." I closed the door. Patrice was not surprised. She had been expecting something like this. What surprised her, she told me later, was the specific legal theory Nolan's team eventually advanced. They filed in Ontario's Superior Court claiming that 2 of Alison's 12 rental properties had been purchased using proceeds from the sale of a condo the 2 of them had owned jointly during their marriage, and that this connection had been insufficiently addressed in the divorce settlement. It was a stretch. The condo sale and the property purchases were separated by nearly 4 years and several intermediate transactions, but it was not nothing. A judge would have to look at it. What Nolan didn't know, what he had badly miscalculated, was that Alison had known this argument was coming. In that filing cabinet she had told me about, behind a folder labeled simply REN, was a document I brought directly to Patrice. It was a legal memo Alison had commissioned from a different law firm, not Patrice's, 2 months before she died. In it, a property law specialist had traced the full transaction history of every one of her 12 units, documenting with complete precision that the 2 properties Nolan was targeting had been purchased using rental income and a private line of credit with no connection to marital assets. The memo anticipated his exact argument and answered it. She had known what he was going to claim, and she had built the rebuttal before he even filed. I sat with that document for a long time the night Patrice showed it to me. My daughter had been dying, and she had spent part of that time that was running out, time she couldn't get back, doing this, building a wall to protect what she had built so that a man who had hurt her once couldn't take it after she was gone. I wasn't sure if I felt proud or devastated. I think it was both. and I think it's still both. The legal proceedings move slowly, as they do. Nolan's team filed in January. We responded in March. There were document productions, examinations for discovery, motions. Patrice managed everything. I was not a passive party. I attended every meeting, reviewed every document she sent me, asked every question I had. Frank, the accountant, became something like a key witness, able to speak to the financial history of the business in detail that no amount of legal argument could obscure. I learned more about Ontario property law in those months than I ever expected to know. I also learned more about Nolan than I had known during the years he was married to my daughter. During discovery, financial records emerged that painted a clearer picture. Nolan had not had continuous employment since 2020. His declared income in the 2 years before filing was under $30,000 annually. He had a judgment against him from a civil suit brought by a former business associate in 2022. And critically, this came out through a forensic review that Patrice requested. There was evidence that Nolan had, during the final months of Alison's illness, attempted to access her business banking portal using credentials he should not have had. He had not succeeded. The bank's security protocols had flagged the attempts and blocked them, but the attempts were logged, time-stamped, documented. Patrice brought this to the Crown. The mortgage fraud charges, based on the unauthorized access attempts and a separate investigation that was opened once authorities looked more carefully at his financial history, took shape over the following months. I was not driving that process, but I was informed of it, and I cooperated fully. The civil trial was scheduled for September, and I will be honest, I was not certain how it would go. Alison's memo was powerful, but legal proceedings don't always follow logic, and Nolan's lawyer was skilled at making the situation seem more ambiguous than it was. There were moments when I sat in that courtroom and felt something close to fear. Not for myself, but for Alison's legacy, for the work she had done, for the tenants whose housing stability was tied to the portfolio she had built. The turning point came from a source I hadn't anticipated. One of Alison's former tenants, a woman who had rented one of the contested properties for 3 years, had become, over time, something more than a tenant. She had helped Alison manage the property informally, handled small maintenance calls when Alison was in treatment, had been present in the building in a way that gave her a detailed, granular knowledge of when and how it had been acquired and operated. Her testimony about the property's history, delivered on the stand with the kind of calm specificity that doesn't come from coaching, corroborated every line of Alison's legal memo. She described conversations she had had with Alison during the purchase process. She described documents she had seen. She described Alison's words, "This one is mine, all mine," about that property specifically. Nolan's lawyer tried to undermine her. It didn't work. She was unshakable. The judge ruled in our favor on all counts. The 2 properties were confirmed as exclusively Alison's estate, to be held in trust as she had directed. Nolan's claim was dismissed. Costs were awarded against him. 3 months after the civil ruling, the Crown's case came to its own conclusion. Nolan pleaded guilty to 1 count of unauthorized use of computer data and 1 count of fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. He received a sentence of 22 months in federal custody and 3 years of probation to follow, with conditions that included no contact with Alison's estate or her beneficiaries. I was present in the courtroom for the sentencing. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, and I felt something that took me a while to identify. I felt finished, like a long project had reached its close. I am 67 years old now. I live in Barrie, in the house I've owned for 30 years, and I manage Alison's estate as her executor and the trustee of the foundation she set up in her mother's name, the Catherine Calloway Foundation, which provides bursaries and transitional housing support for women in Southern Ontario working to establish financial independence. Last year, we helped fund 14 women through the program. This year, we're on track for 20. I didn't build this. Alison built it. I'm just the one who makes sure it keeps running. I think about her every day. I think about her sitting at that kitchen table in Mississauga, coffee gone cold, going through documents with reading glasses pushed up on her head. I think about her voice on the phone, clear and organized, telling me not to worry. I think about the folder in the filing cabinet and the care she put into what she left behind. Some men walk into grief and lie down in it. I understand why. But Alison didn't lie down. Not once. Not through 14 months of a divorce. Not through 8 months of chemo. Not through a recurrence that she knew was coming. She stood up, and she built something, and she made sure it could survive her. The least I could do was stand up too. I've been turning this over for months now, trying to find the cleanest way to say it. And I keep coming back to the same thing. What happened to Nolan wasn't bad luck. It was consequence, plain and slow-moving and completely predictable if you knew what to look for. He spent 9 years making choices. Small ones at first, probably. A shortcut here, a half-truth there, a loan he had no real intention of repaying. And then bigger ones. The bankruptcy, the judgment against him, the attempts to access my daughter's accounts while she was still alive, still fighting. Each choice compounded the last. That's how it works. You don't arrive at the place Nolan ended up in one dramatic moment. You walk there, step by step, and you're so focused on what you want that you stop noticing the ground shifting under you. Alison understood this better than anyone I've known. She built her business the way she built everything, carefully, honestly, with a long view that most people her age don't have. She never cut corners on a lease agreement. She never misrepresented a property. When things were hard, and some years were genuinely hard, carrying 12 units through interest rate hikes and maintenance surprises, she absorbed it and kept going. Not because she was fearless, because she understood that the kind of reputation you build in this industry is the only thing that outlasts the market. That's a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, quietly, in the details. In the way her tenants trusted her, in the way Frank could account for every dollar across 6 years without hesitation. In a legal memo, sitting in a filing cabinet waiting. And that memo. I think about it more than I probably should. She wrote it when she was running out of time. She could have spent those hours resting, or being angry, or grieving her own future. Instead, she sat down with a lawyer she'd never used before, walked through a decade of financial records, and built something designed to function without her. That takes a particular kind of mind. It also takes a particular kind of character. The willingness to do the unglamorous, exhausting work of protecting something you love, even when no one will see you doing it, even when the outcome is uncertain. I'm 67. I spent my career in construction, which means I spent my career watching what gets built and what falls apart. The difference is almost never talent. It's almost always whether someone did the work properly when no one was checking. Alison did the work properly. Every time. Right up until she couldn't anymore. What I want people to take from this, if they take anything, is that these 3 things she lived by are available to all of us. The decency to deal with people honestly. The intelligence to think ahead, to document, to build carefully. The endurance to keep doing both when it's inconvenient, when you're tired, when the situation feels unfair. None of those qualities are inherited. They're chosen over and over in ordinary moments that don't feel significant until later. Nolan chose differently, and the math caught up with him, the way it always does. Alison chose well, and what she built is still standing. That's enough for me.